Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, satellite radio channel 121, and on YouTube, where you can dial us up right now. If you haven't already, search Bloomberg Business News Live. Just let it roll all day while you're working or whatever you're doing here. It's the full Bloomberg radio experience with visuals, if you dare, throughout the day. And we've got a lot to cover here as we mark 100 days. This is all anybody's talking about, beyond, of course, the markets and the economic data that are inextricably tied to the Trump administration. It's going to play out like this. He leaves the bubble pretty soon, actually, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll head over to Joint Base Andrews, and then it's off to the Midwest, to the promised land of Michigan. And he's not going straight to the big rally. We're going to get a big campaign-style rally tonight. And you know, we're all staying up late for this special coverage right here on Bloomberg. But he's starting at Selfridge Air National Guard Base. If you were with us yesterday, you might have heard Congressman Bill Izinga talking about that. There's been an ask in Michigan for more jets. That's why the governor was in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago. Updated jets. They're going to be talking likely about a major investment at Selfridge. And then it's on to the grand event in Macomb County at the Community College Sports Expo Center. They tell us 6 o'clock p.m., what they're billing as the 100th day in office achievement speech. Are we going to get the big one? We get like a Kid Rock concert here? What's going to be involved? I'm waiting to hear more about the choreography because it's going to feel a lot like the campaign. Maybe we'll get a flyover since he's actually the president now, with, of course, a lot of the conversation around promises made, promises kept, right? It's billed as an achievement speech. Of course, one of the big promises was tariffs. Another promise was lower prices. And they keep bumping into each other. We talk about it every day around here. They even pulled out the Treasury Secretary for an early morning briefing. By the way, they've done this twice. You're allowed to chuckle at White House correspondents who have to get up extra early now every morning for the 8:30 a.m. press briefing. Used to be around 2 in the afternoon. Special guest today, the Treasury Secretary, there to answer the big questions on tariffs. When will the trade deals emerge? But more specifically, listen to this exchange. Are we actually talking to China? Because we keep hearing from the White House that we are. Donald Trump even said on the Daily, Beijing says we've never engaged the White House on tariffs. Here's the latest from this morning.
I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, again, of who's talking to whom. But as I said, I believe for the Chinese, these tariffs are unsustainable.
And very quickly, 2 days ago, you said you didn't know if President Trump had spoken to Xi Jinping. Do you know now?
Again, I would say Karoline and I have a lot of jobs around the White House. Running the switchboard isn't one of them.
Running the switchboard ain't one of them. So we still have no idea who's on the phone with whom, or anyone for that matter, with the idea of maybe some other countries arriving at deals first. Japan, maybe India would be the big one. But as we wait, it's not helping with confidence on the corporate level or on the consumer level as we bump into the headline this morning. Consumer confidence slumps to an almost 5-year low. We can talk about abstract politics all day long, but if your job is to be Bloomberg economics editor like Molly Smith, you have to deal with fact, data. You know, Bloomberg, she's with us right now, having survived another 8:30 a.m. call, not for a briefing, but for a data dump. You have no mercy on these White House correspondents. Have to be in the briefing room at 8:30. You do it every day.
We've got other things to do. We've been doing this every day.
That's
confidence actually dropped at 10, so that was a little later.
That's true.
But we had
enough.
something else at 8:30.
You did. I know you're an early bird here, and I want to start on confidence here, because if you look back 5 years, what was that, May of 2020?
Dark times.
What was going on right around that time?
Really dark.
So we just went back to the pandemic in terms of confidence?
That's where the level's at right now. Wow. And this was the 5th straight monthly decline, and that's the longest stretch since 2008. Another time period that probably rings
boy, oh boy.
A really sad bell.
These superlatives are stacking up. So what are consumers saying in this survey?
It's really just a continuation of this tariff-induced anxiety about how this is going to be raising prices on a number of consumer goods, how prospects for what somebody anticipates their financial situation is going to look like are deteriorating markedly, anticipated odds of a recession, wage prospects, just all of these things about how secure you feel in your financial situation have just really weakened dramatically.
We talk a lot about soft data versus hard data. The data are supposed to capture what consumers are doing. We kind of look, as we're wonks at Bloomberg, we kind of assume everyone's walking around looking at GDP and consumers saying, well, geez, maybe I shouldn't buy this. But it's sort of a chicken and egg thing here, right? Where is the consumer when it comes to talk of a recession? Is that kitchen table talk, or is that for people like us?
No, I think this is very real. And that's where, people talk about this so-called vibe session in this idea of the soft data being just so much worse than what the hard data indicates. And that's why when we do actually get the first look at GDP tomorrow, it's going to be so interesting to see how much of this actually comes through in the hard data. Because GDP, some economists I think the median estimate right now is penciling in what would be a very, very small increase. Would be a huge slowdown from the previous quarter. And a lot of that coming from, one, a big drop off in consumer spending. And the bigger one is trade. And all of this so far being that there's been so much import activity to get ahead of these tariffs. And we saw that with the 8:30 data this morning. That was the advanced trades report showing that the goods deficit widened to another record in March. So the import activity has just been rampant, and that's really going to just subtract the most from GDP tomorrow.
We're seeing this as well in the form of fewer container ships off the port of LA, right? So what are we in for tomorrow when GDP comes out? This will be our broadest measure we've had. Since it's mattered, since Liberation Day.
Exactly. So this is for the government's initial estimate of first quarter GDP. And there are a lot of economists who are penciling in a contraction. We haven't had that since 2022.
Wow.
And that would be really dramatic. Again, a lot of it coming from the trade side. So if you are of the camp that maybe imports are going to normalize after this big rush in the first quarter to get ahead of tariffs, then you might be a little bit more sanguine on the outlook for the current quarter for trade and GDP. But it's really hard to tell right now because there's still so much of this up in the air. As you just heard, Bessent can't even tell us who's talking to who right now. So who the heck knows if there's still going to be more of this front-running activity until we really know where the tariff rates are going to settle.
Yeah, so the idea of front-running and the pull forward that we're seeing right now in anticipation of tariffs, does that guarantee a downturn in the back half of the year?
I don't know if I would say...
How do you sustain that?
I mean, I don't know if I would say guarantee a downturn. I think what the biggest thing for our economy is consumer spending. And that's what drives our economic activity more so than what trade does. And I think a lot of economists would also tell you in looking at how to determine when a recession is actually happening, you have to look at the consumer and you have to look at the job market. And trade is, I guess it's more of an exogenous factor compared to those other two.
Okay, well, we're about to look at the job market on Friday. This is the other big one that we have coming. I keep asking you every month, when do the federal worker layoffs start showing up? What are you expecting on Friday?
So we keep thinking that we're going to keep getting these big, more of a moderation in job growth, which has generally been the theme. I mean, except for the fact that the March payrolls report was such a blowout in a good way, that there was such strong job growth. But it looks like that level would drop off pretty materially in April.
This month?
I don't know if I would. I mean, I think that implies that it's really bad. But the median estimate right now for payrolls growth is somewhere in the 115,000 area.
So
that's not bad. That's not a bad number. And the unemployment rate's still holding at 4.2%. Also not bad. But I always like to look at the range of estimates for the payrolls report and how wide the band can be. I mean, sometimes we're looking at a span of 150,000 from the high to the low.
Yeah, sure.
So that median, of course, is who knows where the actual number will lie.
It's interesting what you said to us, though, is we get a contraction in GDP tomorrow. First time since the non-recession, remember, it was two quarters, but it wasn't a recession during the Biden administration. A lot of people think this is the beginning of one. When does that become consensus, or that's not a baseline expectation right now, is it?
I mean, I think right
that
now
we're in one now.
That we're in one now.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would say that. No, I think because again, there's the idea of what you kind of just alluded to, what we'd call a technical recession of these back-to-back quarters of negative GDP. which could very well be a trade story. But
Right.
when you look at actual recession, jobs, spending, that's not really, hasn't happened
and I
yet.
learned a lot about that a couple of
Yeah.
years ago when we met the technical definition, and Molly Smith taught me otherwise. It takes a lot more to call it a recession. Great to have you in Washington. Bloomberg economics editor Molly Smith with us on the fastest show in politics. Stay here live from Washington, only on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, where we don't have a subway, we have a metro. Sometimes it works, much like the apparatus on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. We're going to be talking more about reconciliation, the drive to mark up some bills this week, and of course, what's happening on the other end. That's the big story today. 100 days. How do you feel having experienced it? As we turn to the anatomy of a retraction, this has been an interesting element today. Having started at 8:30 this morning with another early morning call in the White House briefing room, the press secretary and the Treasury secretary today talking about trade, tariffs, the economic agenda on 100 days. This is a big part of what we're going to hear about this evening from President Trump. But this whole idea of Amazon, you heard about this by now, I'm sure, listing tariff prices. When you go to the restaurant, they've got the calorie count on the menu. Makes you not want to buy anything there. You have to order that if it's 1,000 calories. Amazon had an idea to break it out in terms of tariffs. How come my new Fruit of the Loom are so expensive, you ask? And there'd be a little item on there, right, like a service charge, and it would break out the tariffs. Didn't play well at the White House. We all woke up to this story today. The Amazon was considering this. The press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, was asked about it. Here's what she said.
I just got off the phone with the president about Amazon's announcement. This is a hostile and political act by Amazon. It's another reason why we are onshoring critical supply chains here at home to shore up our own critical supply chain and boost our own manufacturing.
Yikes. Called it a hostile and political act by Amazon. Fast forward to noon, statement from the company. That was never under consideration. Amazon says the team that runs our ultra-low-cost Amazon Hall store considered the idea of listing import charges, never approved, and was never going to happen. If you're with us on YouTube, you see the response. Rapid response from Amazon. The stock's been lower, and it's where we start our conversation with a noted Republican strategist who's been through the ringer in multiple campaigns, survived the first Trump administration, and is with us right now at the desk. Alex Conant, partner at Firehouse Strategies, was at one time in a different life, 2008, a spokesman for the Republican National Committee. Also helped to run Marco Rubio's presidential campaign. It's great to see you. Thank you for coming back on Bloomberg.
Good to be with you, Jeff.
So someone like yourself working at Firehouse gets a phone call from Amazon and says, Alex, we need help. What do we do here? A reversal like this is remarkable, and it tells us a lot about the influence this administration has over corporate America, doesn't it?
I don't think any business wants to get in a fight with the White House right now, but I think every business in America is also recognizes the reality that tariffs are going to drive prices up.
Sure.
As we saw in the last administration, inflation is the worst thing that can happen to a president. It's something that voters see everywhere. Every time they're going to fill up the tank, buy eggs, go online to go shopping. When they see prices going up, they get angry. And so, look, Biden didn't survive it. Carter didn't survive it. I think Trump and the Republicans are very sensitive that these tariffs are going to make prices go up. That's why you saw the White House so quick to attack this report.
Right.
They don't want prices to go up, but they really don't want corporate America or any businesses to to blame the president directly on why the prices are going up.
Well, so here you are, it's 100 days, and you need to write an achievement speech, as it's being called, for President Trump. We just spoke to Molly Smith, our economics editor, who's pointing to hard data. We're going to see potentially a contraction in GDP tomorrow. Mm-hmm. You see all the analyst notes. The odds are rising on a recession. We're seeing some creep when it comes to inflation. The bond market's been freaking out a little bit. How do you craft a cohesive message that says we did good in the last 100 days on the economy?
Yeah, look, I can't recall a situation where there's such a disconnect between the mood inside the West Wing and the mood on Main Street, on Wall Street, with the electorate as a whole. If you look at the polls that came out over the weekend, they're really bad for the president, and they're trending badly.
Yeah.
And they're bad because people are losing faith in his ability to handle the economy, which has always been the bedrock of Donald Trump's support since 2015, since 2016. They might not like what he tweets, they might not like some of his personal behavior, but they trust him to handle the economy. If he loses that, he's in real trouble, and that's what we're seeing in the polls. But the mood inside the White House is, look, 100 days in, we're delivering on everything that we promised, everything that the president said he was going to do. He's doing. We got our cabinet confirmed. There's only one nominee, Matt Gaetz, who didn't make it through. The rest were confirmed, for better or worse.
Yeah,
sure. Some of them have had some trouble since then. But the executive orders, he's done more of those than any president in history. His tax reform is moving ahead in Congress. So I think that they feel very, very good about kind of the first 100 days. I think the president's going to be in a really good mood at his rally tonight. But I think the fact that he's doing the rally tonight and that he's doing all the interviews around 100 days is also a reflection that there are voices inside the West Wing. While the mood is good, they can see the storm clouds coming. They recognize he needs to get out there more, sell his agenda. But if the economy's in the tank, a couple rallies isn't going to fix his poll numbers.
I can hear what he's going to say on the border tonight, right? We've locked it down. This is the most secure border in American history. When it comes to the economy, though, is the message just hang on? Give me a little more time. And how much time does he have?
Look, I think, he's going to blame Biden. Right?
Okay, Biden's economy.
Yeah, look, he's going to say, look, the economy was, and the reason he won is because people didn't like the economy, right? Like, people not liking the economy is not a new phenomenon.
That's right.
People haven't liked the economy is why he won. He's going to blame Trump. He's going to say, he's going to blame Biden. He's going to say, look, I inherited the worst economy ever. We're doing X, Y, and Z to fix it, including tariffs, and he's going to try to sell his tariffs. Yeah. But at the end of the day, inflation is not something you can spin away. People are going to get upset about that. Falling stock market, people get upset about that. Recessions, if people start losing their jobs, look, they're going to blame Trump. And this is not I'm a communicator, and I love to say, this is not a communications problem. This is going to be an economic problem. Wow. If the trends that we're seeing that Molly was just talking about, if that actually comes to fruition, Republicans are going to have a real political problem on their hands.
Has there been a communications problem when you have Howard Lutnick on one network, Scott Bessent on another, then the president's doing an hour and a half in the Oval, and everyone's saying something a little bit different about tariffs, about whether we've talked to China, about whether we're going to have exemptions? There has been some confusion in the message. If you were in the communications office, how would you true this up?
Look, I think there's been, to say there's confusion on the tariffs is, I think, is an understatement. There's been no communication strategy on the tariffs. You're right. You have Howard Lutnick out there saying we are going to do tariffs because we're going to raise all this revenue to balance the budget. Right. You've had other people out there saying we're going to do tariffs to get great trade deals so we can do even more trading. You've had other people saying we're going to do tariffs so that we can increase the cost of imports and force people to bring those jobs back to the U.S. so, we can get more factories, more manufacturing in the U.S. All three of those things cannot be true at the same time, right? You can't have great trade deals and raise a bunch of new tariffs. And so I think the fact that, and at the same time, you're asking the American people to make great sacrifices. You're asking them to pay more for the things that they buy every day. Yeah. Which is going to be unpopular. If you're going to ask the American people to make great sacrifice, you have to have a really clear rationale for that, and we haven't heard that from the White House.
What do you do optically tonight? How do you make this different? We're so used to seeing Trump rallies. Yeah. Do you have a big opening act here? Is there a flyover? He's going to be calling people up on the stage, right? Alex, come here. I love you, Alex. Come talk to the people for a minute. Is this a stem winder like we saw in 2024?
I would assume so. Look, I think Trump's current team has survived because they let Trump be Trump. And if it's up to Trump, he's going to do what he did at the Republican National Convention. Look, he gave the longest acceptance speech ever at the RNC. He gave the longest ever State of the Union speech a couple of weeks ago. Tonight's speech is going to be long.
Yeah, okay. Cancel the dinner plans, James. We're going for the long haul here. We're very excited for another late one. Will there be news becomes a question, and does it matter? Does he need to make news tonight? There's talk about some relief that he might offer in the form of auto tariffs, for instance. You go to Michigan, do you have to bring something with you?
Maybe. Look, that's just right. I'm out of the prediction business when it comes to Donald Trump. Who knows what he's going to do, what he's going to say. At the end of the day, look, I think we should all expect some sort of tariff walkback over the next 30 days. You see what importers are saying. You see what the Port of Los Angeles is saying. You see what retailers are expecting. This, if all this comes to fruition, Memorial Day is going to be rough. Politically, the economy is going to be rough. Wow. And so I would expect over the next 30 days to continue to see the sort of tariff walkbacks that we've seen over the last 3 weeks. And maybe he lays out or hints at some of that tonight.
So lawmakers marching in parades and doing town halls, if they do them,
yeah, I mean,
at least Republican lawmakers over Memorial Day weekend are going to get an earful.
Look, if the tariffs go into effect, as he said, and they're allowed to go into effect over the next couple of weeks, you're going to see an economic response to that. It's going to be very negative, and these things lag, right? First you see fewer imports. Then, look, if container ships are not coming into the Port of Los Angeles, right, then you don't need the truck drivers to drive those goods to the stores. If the stores don't have things to sell, you don't need people working hourly. If there's nothing to buy, prices are going to go up. People are going to get frustrated. Right. This is all very foreseeable. I think you guys on Bloomberg are talking about it every single day. I think people inside the White House recognize this is coming, which is why you have seen the steady walking back of the tariffs. I would expect to continue to see that. If you don't see that, then there is going to be, I think, real economic headwinds this summer, and the White House is going to face the political penalty for
that. You hear lines about empty shelves, so that's a horrifying thought for any administration. In our remaining moment, then, you're a political strategist. If you're a Democrat right now, are you writing the menu for the midterms?
Look, it turns out James Carville was right? Like all Democrats needed to do was go into hiding. The president's poll numbers are not down because Democrats have figured out, effective messaging. To the contrary, I think the messaging we've seen from the Democrats is pretty lousy. But they're in the opposition, right? Yeah. And so they're going to benefit in the midterm. Look, if the economy's in the tank and Trump is unpopular, the Democrats are going to have a good midterms, just like Republicans did 4 years ago.
Fascinating. I'm really glad to have you back in the fold here. Alex Conant, thank you so much. Firehouse Strategies, big thanks to Maddie and your team for putting us back in touch. Let's keep this conversation going because this is not one that's going to go away anytime soon. A voice of experience here in Washington, Republican strategist Alex Conant, many thanks here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Glad you're with us here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We're seeing a new trend here in Washington this week, which is a pre-opening bell briefing here in Washington from the White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt. 2 mornings in a row, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time is when these have been called, and she's been joined by other officials in the administration. Yesterday it was Tom Homan, who of course is the border czar. Today it was the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. As tariffs, as always, remain in focus, specifically tariff negotiations with trading partners, and the ongoing question as to whether or not those negotiations are even happening with China at the moment. This was the Treasury Secretary earlier.
I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, again, of who's talking to whom. But as I said, I believe for the Chinese, these tariffs are unsustainable.
And very quickly, 2 days ago, you said you didn't know if President Trump had spoken to Xi Jinping. Do you know now?
Again, I would say Karoline and I have a lot of jobs around the White House. Running the switchboard isn't one of them.
Running the switchboard isn't one of them. Maybe Tyler can help us with the switchboard. She's made her way to Michigan, where President Trump is going to be speaking later in what's being billed as an achievement speech marking 100 days. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall in Warren, Michigan. It's at a community college. Tyler, set the stage for us.
Yeah, hey, Jim. So Warren, Michigan, we're in Macomb County. You can probably hear the crowd behind me. We're going to show you what the scene already looks like. For our radio listeners, you can see people are already starting to line up here as President Trump is expected to take the stage at 6 p.m. Eastern. This is an auto industry hub. In fact, a county official tells me the area has 338 vehicle manufacturers that employs about 22,000 people. And it comes as President Trump is expected to sign those executive orders on Air Force One on his way over here to Michigan that you've been talking about that could give some reprieve to automakers. That includes preventing the stacking of levies for automakers so that they wouldn't be subject to that 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, for example. It also would potentially modify how we see auto parts tariffs end up being tariffed by allowing companies that make the fully assembled vehicles in the United States to get an offset of up to 3.75% of the MSRP value for the next year. Now, administration officials, and we should be clear, this is not changing the actual 25% tariff rate that automakers are facing, but administration officials say that this should give them at least a little bit of a boost, a little bit of a reprieve to reshore manufacturing to places like Michigan. Here's what the Treasury Secretary had to say about it earlier today.
I can tell you that it will go substantially toward reshoring American auto manufacturing. And again, the goal here is to bring back the high quality industrial jobs to the U.S.
I was on a press call earlier today with senior commerce officials who told us reporters that ultimately it really was the talks with the big three automakers that made the difference here, that ultimately spurred the administration to make these changes, because the White House says that they have gotten commitments from these companies to reshore production, and they just needed a little more time.
Well, and Tyler, obviously no surprise that this is likely to feature heavily in the president's speech tonight, given where he is speaking, and we can already hear the excitement of the crowd that is gathering hours early. What are his other primary messages going to be tonight for those who are assembled to see him?
Well, the administration really is focusing on the two prongs of its economic approach today, with Scott Bessent this morning touting progress when it comes to tariff negotiations, although we have yet to see any more concrete details about exactly where those stand. And then the other priority is that they are pushing, that they are moving very fast to get his tax agenda through. In fact, President Trump told Michigan Republicans not to come here tonight because he wants them to stay in Washington to get done the reconciliation package. We heard from the Treasury Secretary yesterday that they would like to see the entire package done by July 4th. It's something that Senate Majority Leader John Thune said was an aspirational goal. Instead, we're really thinking that that X date is going to be the hard deadline for lawmakers. But it is clear that this White House is pushing to get more cash into consumers' pockets, quickly try to turn the attention there as they deal with the fallout when it comes to the tariffs from retailers and consumers alike.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live in Warren, Michigan, where it is already loud. I can't imagine what it's going to be like this evening when President Trump speaks at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you so much, Tyler. And for a kind of taste as to what we might be able to get from President Trump tonight, beyond what we just heard from Tyler, let's hear from the president himself, some of the highlights of his first 100 days in office.
The golden age of America begins right now. I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs. My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. China, 67%. They're sending fentanyl to Mexico and Canada. You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. One of the most important initiatives is DOGE.
We're going to be cutting taxes, and it's possible we'll do a complete tax cut.
I have a great relationship with President Xi. I hope it's going to stay that way. We are finally going to be able to make America great again, greater than ever before.
Words from the Republican president of the United States. And we want to get the other side now from a Democratic leader of a state, the state of Kansas specifically. Its governor, the chair of the Democratic Governors Association, mind you, Laura Kelly, is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Governor, thank you very much for being with us here on Balance of Power. I would imagine it will be several times tonight. We might hear some iteration of promises made, promises kept by President Trump, and hear those words from his lips. He argues, Governor, that what we have seen over the last 100 days is him fulfilling the desire of the voters who elected him. Is he fundamentally wrong about that?
I don't know if I would say he is wrong. I mean, certainly in his mind, he feels like he said he was going to do all of these things, and he's doing all of them. And there are actually some of the things that he proposed doing that I think everybody would agree could be very good things. You know, certainly we're all cognizant of the fact that we had an issue at our border and that needs to be cleaned up. I would agree. I think, though, we can't leave it just at cleaning up the border and deporting people who may or may not be criminals. I think it needs to go further than that. To deal with the entire immigration issue and come up with finally a comprehensive immigration reform package that works for our states. Every state I know is facing workforce shortages, and by deporting potential workers, we are not working towards resolution of that. We really need the administration and Congress to sit down and finally come up with a real solution that would resolve the border issue, but also resolve our workforce issue.
Governor Kailey, we're lucky to talk to a lot of elected officials on this program, but it's always different when you speak to an executive. Governors and mayors simply have a different reality than a lot of elected officials here in Washington who play the partisan game and do a lot of talking. You have to deal with things like balancing budgets, making sure services are delivered, making sure roads are paved, actual things that impact constituents' lives. And so I'm curious what your pragmatic view is of this waiting period, this sort of limbo that we're in right now, and how much time President Trump actually has to set the record straight and deliver a clear message on tariffs. You're talking to voters every day about this. Is that window about to close?
Well, I think we're past time. I think the first 100 days of this administration has just sown chaos and uncertainty all across the country. And all across issues and industries. The tariff issue is obviously the one that's most prominent and clearly creating issues for our economies in our states. In my state alone, we have worked so hard over the last 6 years and been very successful in growing our economy, in bringing in new and different industries into our state, creating 75,000 jobs, bringing in $22 billion worth of new capital investment, which is huge for a state like Kansas. All of what we've been doing is getting put up in the air as the companies that we have recruited, the companies that are here, are dealing with all of this chaos and uncertainty on the tariff issue, and they don't know where to go or what will work as they move forward. So everybody's getting to a standstill kind of position, which is not good for the companies, and it's certainly not good for our states. So, while I recognize that every new administration has the right and responsibility to, put into place policies and procedures that they think are necessary to move the country in a way that they think appropriate, but doing it in this way where it's just willy-nilly, one thing one day, another thing the next day, isn't helpful. Not to move their agenda forward, but certainly not to help our states stay on a path.
Well, and your state specifically, Governor, has more than 50,000 farms, and I wonder what you're hearing from farmers specifically about the impact of tariffs on them and whether they're going to need to count on subsidies from either the state government or the federal government to offset the impact.
Well, we have two major industries here in the state of Kansas. Aviation is one of them, and as has been in the paper, there are lots of issues going on with the aviation industry as a result of these tariffs and these sort of international battles that are going on right now. But certainly in agriculture here in Kansas, but then across the country, the tariffs create absolute havoc and real concern for our farmers. I was the very first, maybe the only Democratic governor who signed on to the USMCA, the trade deal that the Trump administration put together in his first administration, dealing with our relationship with Canada, Mexico, and the United States. I signed on to that because I thought it was in the best interest of Kansas, and now that's all being thrown out. Nothing's really replacing it. But what has happened is that our relationship, particularly with our two biggest trade partners, Canada and Mexico, are in a shambles. Our farmers very much depend upon the potash that they get from Canada to fertilize their fields. A lot of our produce and stuff, which we can't grow here, is brought in from Mexico. Our exports, when, for instance, when the USAID was sort of shut down, moments after he took office, we had, I don't know how many millions of pounds of Milo that was sitting in silos here in the state of Kansas. Their only customer was the USDA. They were growing this specifically for them to use. So my farmers are stuck with this stuff, and the market has been completely shut down. So there are a lot of problems, and we absolutely have got to come to some resolution very quickly. And they don't want a handout. They got that the first time around. Remember that tariffs were put in place in the first Trump administration, and they did backfill that with cash. The farmers don't want that. That's a Band-Aid that doesn't do anything for them going forward. And I think their biggest fear with what's going on right now is that not only are they not able to sell their product right now, or export their products right, but that they will ultimately lose their markets. That countries aren't going to wait forever. They're going to go find somebody else who can supply what Kansas farmers have been supplying. So it is a huge concern, and one that I hope this administration will wake up to and finally deal with, because
Governor Kailey, we only have 1 minute left. I want to give you an opportunity to pre-butt what we're going to hear this evening. Donald Trump carried your state by more than 16 points in 2024. What's your message to voters on this 100th day of the Trump administration?
Well, there's not a lot to say to voters right now. We don't have an election. Midterms aren't until 26. Another presidential election is not till 28. But I would say to all citizens that they need to make a lot of noise about how this is really impacting them and their lives. And they need to make that noise so that their congressional representatives hear them. Because what's happening right now is impacting people all across this country, whether they're talking about what they're thinking about doing with Medicaid, obviously what's happening with tariffs, and what's happening in our higher education system. Lots and lots. They need to get loud.
We're glad you could be with us. Laura Kelly, the governor of Kansas, chair of the Democratic Governors Association, on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Not just any Tuesday, of course, the day in which President Trump is marking 100 days back in the White House. And of course, over the last 100 days, we've seen a lot of action emanating from the executive branch, from President Trump himself, the signing of hundreds of executive orders or memoranda, the implementation of tariffs and the like, things that he hasn't really needed Congress to go with him on, and Congress hasn't really expressed much interest in countering him on that. But the problem, Joe, is for the next portion of the president's agenda, the next 100 days, he's going to need Congress.
That's true.
To get a lot of what he would like to achieve across the finish line.
Well, if you think about it broadly, too, I mean, that's when trade deals would need to be announced, right?
True.
The 90-day period would be wrapped up. We have to deal with Trump tax cuts, and we could get an X-date this week that lands a debt ceiling in the early summer. So, yeah, the second 100 days could be really interesting here, and it's where we start our conversation with our panel as we round the first 100. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are here, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick is partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie is Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So happy 100 days, everybody. Rick, how much does President Trump have to show for the first 100 days, but also how much news does he need to make? Because there is an expectation he's going to make an announcement, no mystery that he's in the suburbs of Detroit here, to make an announcement on auto tariffs that we just heard from the White House. The auto industry will be happy with the announcement, some relief on tariffs that will prevent them from being stacked on top of each other here. Rick, does he need to bring the goods to Michigan?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not sure it's a happy 100 days. I mean, it's a pretty sober 100 days. You know, what everybody thought was going to be open season on, you know, investments and mergers and IOPs and, you know, less government regulation and more entrepreneurship has turned into exactly the opposite. Real serious questions about global trade, attacking the Fed's independence. I mean, this has had a real salutary effect on the economy, and S&P down 8%, worse than any president since Gerald Ford in his first 100 days. And we know what was going on back then. So the reality is that I think today he's got a chance to try and start peeling some of that back. Obviously, they are forecasting release of some of these tariffs on parts for car manufacturers. Good start. You kind of scratch your head and go, okay, well, why did we do that to begin with? Why? I mean, like, you know, these are parts that all go into automobiles that are going to be made in the U.S. ultimately anyway. Why did we put tariffs on them to begin with? And so I think there's going to be a lot of that head scratching, because hopefully this is the beginning of a whole series of things, including, as you point out, deals that we're making with other countries that will lower the reciprocity tariffs, that reciprocal tariffs that were already put on. Well, you know, if we're going to cut those deals, why didn't we just reach out and say, hey, we're going to cut a new deal with you before we put these reciprocal tariffs on? I honestly don't really get the strategy, and it's not working with the American public, but tonight maybe we see the claw back on some of that.
Well, and I wonder how much tonight will focus not just on tariffs, Jeannie, but the other kind of domestically oriented efforts that the president has undertaken, in part with Elon Musk at his side, like the dramatic reduction in the federal government, the complete dismantling of agencies like USAID or the CFPB, arguably. How much, Jeannie, is his 100 days actually marked by something that could be, if not a permanent change to the federal bureaucracy, something that would take years to unwind even once he leaves office, or rather than unwinding, perhaps rebuilding?
Yeah, much of what he's done can take a long time. You know, things he's done via EO, we usually say, well, a new president could walk that back. But that's harder in those areas you're talking about, Kailey, like the cuts in DOGE. How do you bring a workforce back if you want to do that? How do you rebuild departments? I mean, just take USAID as an example. You know, that's going to be a big, big challenge. And, you know, as I look at what the president is facing, he certainly is not going to want to focus on the economy tonight, because the economy, according to every poll you look at, is in disarray. So he's going to want to talk about things like immigration and DOGE, but he's not incredibly popular on that either. And so this is going to be difficult. You know, Karl Rove got on Fox News and said the president has a huge problem, and that is, number one, his support as it pertains to the economy, both short-term and long-term, has all but plummeted and is in very bad shape. And Karl Rove, as we know, is no liberal. So how do you walk back from that? Very tough. And then I look at the Atlantic interview where the reporters asked him point blank, is there any red line, any sign of the U.S. economy plummeting where you would say, okay, enough is enough and I'm going to walk back from my commitment to tariffs? And he said, no, there's no red line. I've been committed to this for 30 years. Nothing could change my mind. So that is a very sobering reality as we look out there. And so I think it leaves him with a real challenge tonight.
Well, Rick, Democrats are counting the ways here. The top Democrats on the House and Senate Appropriations Committee are out with a letter here. They've even created a tracker to determine the billions of dollars in funding allocated by Congress that has been blocked or withheld by this administration. This is $430 billion, according to Rosa DeLauro and Senator Patty Murray. $430 billion for medical research, disaster relief, aid to farmers. I could go on here. It's almost like they're taking a page out of Elon Musk. Remember the wall of receipts? We now have a tracker to determine the money that's not being spent. Is this the type of strategy that works?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize there are kind of like three buckets that everybody's talking about. There's that Doge bucket that went from we're going to cut $2 trillion out of the budget to now we're going to cut $150 billion, right? And these are cuts. These are things that will likely not come back. Then there's this $430 billion, which are things they're authorized to spend the money on. They're just not spending it. Those checks aren't going out. The funds aren't made available to the programs that have been authorized by Congress to do. And that's what Congress is tracking, saying, hey, this stuff is supposed to be done. There's a third bucket that Russ Vought's about to send to Congress, which is $9 billion of rescissions. That means here's money you gave us. We're giving it back. We're not going to spend that money. And so like there is a massive reduction in spending by the federal government going on, none of which we can really track effectively right now. And by the way, we talk as if the first 100 days is at the end of the administration. We have 3 years and 400 days left to this administration, and we're just getting started. So I think you can anticipate this fight continuing for a long time.
Well, it certainly is incredible to consider the more than 1,300 days that we still have left. But of course, the president may be thinking about a kind of more immediate deadline here, Jeannie, as he wants to make sure he can get a maximum amount done with control of both chambers of Congress. Right now, Republicans have control. That could change after the midterms next year, which is why they're trying to force through this budget reconciliation package with his tax cuts included as quickly as possible. The Treasury Secretary says now July 4th is really the target to get this done. It had previously been touted by the Speaker of the House as something that would be accomplished, at least in that chamber, by Memorial Day, knowing that the debt ceiling could be a factor in here as well. Is this really going to be something that can be completed by the August recess, given the difficulty of some of the subject matter that Republicans are going to have to tackle in the coming weeks?
Yeah, they really want to just ruin your summer, Kailey. Forget about the beach. You're going to be working either Memorial Day, July 4th. It's going to be tough either way. I think in an odd way, the fact that the debt ceiling, they may come up to it, may light a fire under them. But either way, there is going to be a lot of inter-party squabbling on these issues because we've got these small groups of Republicans who are committed, and they, unlike Donald Trump when it comes to tariffs, they do have a red line that they won't go over. I mean, we were just talking about clawbacks, and you've even got a group of Republicans in Congress who say, we don't want clawbacks of the IRA. Quite frankly, we like those investments that Joe Biden made. Then you've got the other deficit hawks. And then, of course, you've got the folks on SALT, which, is one of my personal favorites. Then, you've also got folks who are saying, we're going to draw a red line as it pertains to something else. And so these groups are going to have to come together and figure this out. And it's going to be hard to do in a short period of time. And of course, Donald Trump is running right smack dab into a Madisonian government. It's all about divided power. Everything he's done this first 100 days has been unilateral executive power. Now he's got to deal with this other branch he's been able to run over for some time. But if they look at the same polls Karl Rove is looking at, they may decide it's not in their interest, and they indeed could lose their seats if they go along with what the president is proposing. So I think July 4th is ambitious, but Scott Bessent's a smart guy. Maybe he knows something I don't, but I think it's an ambitious timeline.
Does that unilateral approach, Rick, that Jeannie describes, the playbook for the next 100 days?
Yeah, I don't think so. Look, I mean, even though Donald Trump did a lot of things through executive order, which he'll continue to do throughout his presidency, all he has to do is pick up the front page of any newspaper and say, I'm going to issue an executive order on that today. That seems to be his MO. But remember, Congress gave him his cabinet. There were hearings, there were the votes in the House, in the Senate to confirm every member of his administration's cabinet, and the members had lots of opportunity there to hang people up and make it, quote, worth their while on a policy basis. But they didn't do it, and now they're all rallying around, the big, beautiful reconciliation bill, and I have no doubt that's what will become law.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, our political panel, thank you so much joining us as we mark 100 days in office for President Trump and look ahead to his big speech in Michigan tonight, again slated for 6 p.m.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.